Good evening to all from India. This is Abhivardhan from Internationalism and Global Assembly, and here we are for amazing session for Global Hint, Episode 8, Season 2. Here we have two amazing panelists with us. But we'll discuss upon that later. So we have Dr. Alvite Ning Hojum and Akshob Girdhar Das. I would like to introduce the panelists. We were also going to be joined by Rishabh Vats. You know Rishabh Vats on Twitter. You can find him. He's a visiting professor at Morsi Mumbai. So, due to certain special reasons, Rishabh could not join. However, we have Dr. Alvite and Akshob with us. Dr. Alvite is from Symbiosis Pune. He's uh, uh, he's currently an assistant professor in the Symbiosis School of International Studies. Uh, and with respect to Akshob is a visiting fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. So let me put some tone on the discussion and let me say some background context for the viewers as well as the panelists in a brief way for the first 3 minutes. In the first 3 minutes, to be very honest. So it's been a year since the Abraham Accords has been agreed by various countries in the West Asian region with the State of Israel. And ironically, as we see the development of the Abraham Accords, people might not consider it much important as compared to the US-China rivalry, which is emerging in the Indo-Pacific region. The Abraham Accords at a landlocked level and to some extent maritime, not much right now, but to some extent might show a larger scope of cooperation when it comes to development as well as security issues in the Indo-Pacific region, because the Middle East, which we call as West Asia and North Africa, have a very important stake there, whether it is the Mediterranean or whether we talk about the Saudis in the Gulf. We have seen that they are also important Indo-Pacific stakeholders. So in this discussion, we will be focusing on the following aspects, and I would like to make that very simple. It has been a year, and we have seen that even under the Biden administration, there is no partisanship here. That we find, you know what, Trump is gone, so let's not follow the Abraham Accords. We'll adhere with it. There is an institutional cooperation which has been put in a very clear sense. So, how has the US seen that cooperation between countries like Israel and Morocco or Israel and UAE and other countries has been possible? We can also discuss about a little bit about the history of Abraham Accords, because of course this is not limited to Donald Trump and Jared Kushner. There's a history behind the Abraham Accords and the need to cooperate between Israel and UAE. Then we will be discussing about post Abraham Accords acceptance within a few with few countries and Israel. How actually did it play out? What security arrangements were accepted, or maybe some economic agreements which were, put into forth? Uh, what has been the role of India in West Asia post Abraham Accords? Because India had endorsed the role of the Abraham Accords. After which, we will be also discussing about how can the West Asian countries, considering the success or failure, whatever we say, for the Abraham Accord model, learn from the situation in Afghanistan, especially as Taliban has got its own stronghold and it's already violating the request, not a request basically, but the demands raised by the UNSC members, especially under the presidency of India in August of 2021. And let me remind those, as Ambassador Esther Murthy stated it, that first respect and protect the minorities as well as women, which they did not do. There are severe attacks we see. Recently, a mosque of belonging to the Shia community of Muslims was devastated, and Taliban could not, the Islamic Emirate as they call it, they did not protect it. And the second was basically to not be a territory which manufactures or promotes terrorism in any way, or outsourcing, to be very honest. That again is something which is dwindling, and Taliban has not adhered with it. So Afghanistan is there, and it is a follow up to the last discussion I had with Rishabh, Patrick Mercer, MP, and other panelists. And the last portion which we will be discussing about is the role of European Union also in West Asia when it comes to development-related cooperation. Since France is also thinking of a Galilean approach, is there's a scope to collaborate. So let me begin with Dr. Alvite and Akshob right away. And I have a very basic first question about the success of the Abraham Accords, so that viewers get a guess about it. So, how do you see the way the US went after the acceptance of the Abraham Accords between Israel and other countries, and how has the US contributed to germinate its foundations as well as its aftermath, and how has been the scenario of cooperation between Israel and other West Asian countries. So it's up to the panelists. Maybe Akshay can begin or Dr. Albert can begin.
I'm sure you can go ahead.
Well, thank you, Dr. Alvite. I mean, thank you once again, Abhivardhan, and it's a pleasure to be on this. Look, obviously, we're talking about a year after Abraham Accords, and that was obviously very sacrosanct in some ways because while Israel has had diplomatic relations with Arab neighbors in the past, first Egypt and then Jordan, full diplomatic relations, they're not really the Gulf GCC countries, right? And fundamentally, the GCC countries have operated on three principles: that is, no recognition of Israel, no agreement with Israel, and nothing until the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which is perhaps the most intractable conflict there is on the face of the earth, gets solved. And you normally saw the United Arab Emirates always being in lockstep with Saudi Arabia, and even though both Saudi Arabia and Israel have been public allies of the United States, you that fundamentally you thought that would not come to fruition anytime soon. And particularly given that Israeli politics in the past few years have shifted constantly right, and the former Prime Minister of Israel now, Bibi Netanyahu, was one of the most hawkish prime ministers. And let's not forget, since Ehud Barak, there's really been no overtures from Israel's side towards a two-state solution. There's been increased settlements, more land grabs, and more the Palestinian issue has been relegated. I'm happy to come into it a little later. And fundamentally, this is a little surprising for a few reasons. One is someone like Trump, again now former president, was seen as someone very insular. It was seen someone who was was obviously a populist, but was very domestic focused president somewhere, right? He wrote on the back of the fact that America's place in the world is no longer America's place in the world in the same way. Like he pulled back NATO funding, spoke about how NAFTA was a bad deal, wanted to pull out US-EU relations became weak, pulled out from the TPP, which is obviously a very crucial pivot of the United States, in Asia Pacific to counter the China hegemony, which of course we'll get into. But with Trump pulling out of all of this, including Paris climate change, JCPOA, it seemed very fundamental that Trump was not going to be interested in any long-term intractable conflicts. And so it's a little ironic if you look at the whole landscape of Trump's foreign policy that him and his son-in-law, in his special advisor capacity, sat and brokered a very, with all intents and purposes, a very complicated but seminal deal, such as the Abraham Accords. Now, obviously, Abraham Accords gets four countries into the fray, Arab nations, particularly UAE and Bahrain, which, of course, you would have thought UAE and Saudi Arabia being in lockstep, that has changed. But let's also not forget the elephant in the room in the Middle East has always been Iran. For Saudi Arabia, for too long, even though publicly Saudi Arabia has no relations with Israel, while Saudi Arabia publicly has said that, look, until a resolution is reached on the Palestine issue, there cannot be full diplomatic relations. But that's the public overture. Since MBS has come in, we've seen MBS and then Bibi Netanyahu have had many backroom channel discussions. And the United States, of course, is privy to it because both are key allies of Washington, and all three find Tehran a big adversary, right? And this has come to a point where Tehran and Riyadh have coalesced on under-the-table deals on countering Tehran's role in the Middle East as well. And fundamentally, the UAE too, which finds Tehran a bit of an antagonist, has long seen a reason to mitigate Iran's role. Don't forget, the UAE is one of the key players in the sanctions on Qatar a few years ago because they felt Qatar was lockstep with Iran. So when the Abraham Accords came up, it's definitely very seminal. It obviously has increased trade with Israel and the Gulf regions. I think Israel and UAE alone report around $750 billion of this thing. The UAE opened an embassy in Tel Aviv. Israel's opened an embassy in Abu Dhabi and a consulate in Dubai. So immediately there have been relations. There's been a UAE-Israel Business Council formed. So moment diplomatic relations have established, we know trade is obviously a crucial portion. A lot of cross-border exchange of goods and services. Obviously the restrictions of people flying has been taken off. We saw people from the Emirati government in Jerusalem early last year. So that's what I want to set the stone before I pass on to Dr. Alvite, just like the overarchingness of the Abraham Accords, and then we can get into the minutiae of what this means for the more delicate balancing of geopolitics in a very, very fractious region.
Yes, Dr. Albert.
Yeah. Avi, thank you for having me this evening. In fact, speaking with somebody, I think you are in UP right now. I also would like to say thanks to Akshay for giving a very good introductory remark, of very comprehensive remark of what this accord entails and how did it come about. Just just to take on the point of your regarding the history, or how it all started. Uh, Acceptance and recognition in the wider Middle East or beyond has always been one of the most important foreign policy objectives for Israel ever since they have started ever since they have established itself as a state in May 1948. And they have something called peripheral diplomacy, which they have deployed during the 50s and the 60s to break out of the Arab encirclement, and went all the way up to northern African region, Morocco, Sudan, Ethiopia, Yemen, and others. But I would very well say that whatever we are witnessing right now is some sort of a new form of peripheral diplomacy. But what is interesting at this point is that it is not well beyond the Middle East, but it is taking place within the Middle East right now. It is also for a country like Israel that has been and that continues to fight for its, legitimation, legitimate right to be a country in the international community. This is a very significant breakthrough, for Israel, and at the same time for those four Arab countries like Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, and UAE, and particularly for a heavyweight like UAE and Bahrain from the Middle East to have gone into some sort of a political normalization is also a very significant development. So, it is, I would say that it is, in fact, a very important political achievement and a breakthrough for Israel. And the debate has been for quite a while that there are a couple of factors why they have started to go into some sort of a tacit cooperation between these countries in the last few years. And one of them, as mentioned by Akshob, is the Iranian factor. That the moment, particularly with the fall of Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 2003, the only country in the region that is viewed to be as a strong power is Iran after the fall of Iraq. And with the exposure of the Iranian nuclear program in the early part of 2000s, particularly in 2003, 2 and 3, there were lots of concerns being raised by the Sunni Arab countries, particularly, about the real intentions of Iran going nuclear. So that had sort of, started to stitch together these countries that were not earlier, even looking at, eye to eye with one another. And over the period of time, we have started seeing this, in fact, reading about some sort of a very quiet diplomacy going on between Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel and UAE, and those were mostly in the tactical field, like intelligence sharing cooperation. And one of the events, particularly the WikiLeaks that had come out in 2010, latter part of 2010, I think in December, I was in Israel when those news broke out about how the Saudi king was talking about cutting the head of the snake. That is the Iranian, leadership around that period of time, supreme leader and the president of the time. So there had been lots of, things going on behind the veil, and this was one of the results. And why the U.S., the Trump administration, as mentioned by Akshob, had been, I think it was kind of very timely for the Donald Trump administration to see to find the nerves, to actually smell the coffee of things that were coming. And they had given a good amount of attention towards normalizing the relations between the two sides. That is between Israel and the UAE, Israel and Bahrain, and the other remaining two countries. The second factor over the period of time, that again, this would be more of a recent phenomenon, is the rising influence of Turkey in the region also. So if you see some of the geopolitical dynamics in the last, say, 5 to 6 years, particularly time, even Turkey is also kind of flexing its muscles. You can see that in Syria. You can see that during the Gulf crisis of 2017, when Qatar had to snap diplomatic ties with UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Then Turkey was acting like a big brother, trying to cater to the concerns of the Qatari government. So you can see that it's not only in the Middle East, mind you. What we are witnessing in the international community or international relations like right now is we are connecting many dots, like not only in the Middle East but also in different parts of the world. So that is when some of your points that you raised in your email that you sent to us about Indo-Pacific and the others can all be interlinked. But in the Middle East, if we have to say, these are some of the factors, as mentioned by my fellow panelists, about the Iranian dimension and now the Turkish dimension. And beyond that, we can of course go into the details over the course of our discussion about certain inward-looking policies being adopted by many of these countries in the last 5 to 6 years time again. So many of these countries had come out with their own vision programs, economic reform programs, due to which they need partnerships with countries like Israel, which is like a technological giant, military giant, or in any other technology you can think of. So I would keep it that way for my introductory remark, and we can go ahead with the discussion.
Great. Akshay, would you like to give a follow-up or add something? I think you're mute. You can just unmute yourself. Yeah.
Again, sorry, used to do this. No, I think Dr. Alvite has already summed it up well, and I think that sets the stone well. I will say this though, from my visit to Israel as well in 3-4 years ago, one of my highlight of the experience was also going to the Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then the Palestinian Assistant Minister to Europe, was addressing us, and one of the things that you do take cognizance of is the people who feel most aggrieved by this obviously are the Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership, because for too long, they're holding on to the promise that the Arab nations will back them. And constantly, even long before the Abraham Accords, there's been a complete dereliction of that duty, none more so than from Saudi Arabia. And that angst, that frustration, that NUI was very, very visible from the Palestinians. This is Saudi Arabia. This is 2018, right? This is before the Abraham Accords even fructified. And this is just shortly after Trump decided to move the embassy to Jerusalem. So that also was a very, very important overture. So you saw that if at all you want to take it as a harbinger of things to come, maybe today we can look at it that way. That was definitely a sign, because successive Democratic and Republican administrations all agreed on one thing, that not to tamper, well, Israel's an ally and Israel's the strongest ally of the United States, and rather, the United States is Israel's all-weather ally. They would not tamper with the location of the embassy. Internationally, Jerusalem remains a contested region. That is still what the international laws do dictate. That, and if you go by the 67 rules as well, Jerusalem is, supposed to be an autonomous region, supposed to be shared by the Israeli and Palestinian authorities, given its sacrosanctity to all three Abrahamic faiths. And which is why the United States is very cognizant, right from Nixon till Obama. Everyone was very, very cognizant of the fact that the embassy would remain in Tel Aviv, and Trump decided to do what Trump decided to do, and of course it was a very contested move. It cleared up tensions again, and what the Palestinians that time told me was that there was nothing but complete disappointment in Saudis, because we said Bibi and MBS had many under the table meetings of the like we also know when. Sometimes, as we say, it's so covert that it's actually overt. Like everyone knows when something's going on, even though it's not publicly acknowledged and there's no paparazzi for it. And because the Saudis recalibrated their priorities towards containment of Iran, which again is a very Cold War strategy of containment, and Israel piggybacked off that, right? I mean, I don't want to reduce complicated geopolitics to anodyne homilies of enemy of my enemy is my friend, but there was a sense of that being there, and all of this. The Palestinians have been left behind, except for the Algerians. No one really was voicing out any concerns on the Palestinians. The GCC countries would publicly not acknowledge Israel, but the cause of batting for a Palestinian homeland had long gone, and we've seen that there's no overtures from the Israel side. And when moment the Arab countries, quieted down, this something like the Abraham Accords was, only meant to happen. I mean, as Dr. Alvite said, there was also the alacrity of getting military drone technology from Israel, agriculture technology from Israel, and of course, most importantly, the U.S. strong arming. I mean, under Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump, that this administration did not hold back its punches and was very, very clear on what they expected ally countries to do, and it came around. Of course, Saudi Arabia is the capital of the Islamic world, and perhaps had to calibrate that a little more carefully. But we all know that there are more sort of diplomatic approach points towards Israel. So.
Great. So I think we have reached to a very interesting point in the beginning itself, and I'm very delighted that we have uh, discussed about the basic aspects and how the trajectory has transformed per se. So within this first portion, I have a follow-up question, and this follow-up question is regarding certain disruptive actors, and from there we can maybe link it to the next part of this discussion, which is the role of India and how India has dealt with West Asian countries, including Iran, because uh, when it comes to Indian diplomacy, an interesting part is that Far East, Act Far East, or let's say Act East, not say Far East. Far East is near Russia. Let's say Act East policy, which is one of India's important, I would say, uh, considerations in foreign policy. And second is, of course, considering West Asia as something civilizational, as Ambassador Trimurti called it in UNGA and UNSC a long time back. I think interestingly, one thing, and that's why I will not ask on India right now, is that Dr. Alveit mentioned about Turkey and Erdogan. And we know that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is gone. It's not there anymore. In fact, I have heard the news that some railroads are being made between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Some sort of cooperation under Turkey and Russia is happening. Now, ironically, uh, and I could add the Afghanistan question, but not right now. It would be complicated for now. So let's do it afterwards. So, how do we see the role of the very intent of Turkey per se, and how because one thing which I generally see as a trend is that the fragility or the stability of West Asia has much relationship with those countries who are near the Mediterranean to some extent. I'm not saying to a larger extent, and from there, since we see that the role itself escalates, there are several proxies whose realignments are happening in their own way. I mean, we can relate it to the way that Trump dealt with ISIS in Syria, and of course, he bargained with Turkey for the sake of cooperation whatsoever. Biden, when he was the presidential candidate of before, and if I'm right, he stated in the US that Erdogan is somebody who has to be tackled up for the migrant crisis and so forth. But again, that's a different issue altogether. So I'm more centralizing this question on Turkey and the proxies who are actually related to her because of the movements and so forth. Uh, as it comes to being, when it comes to these particular actors, have they kind of affected the security arrangements or the economic entanglements which are being considered? And yes, of course, some examples can be discussed by the panelists when it comes to what kind of economic and security arrangements have been agreed to. Because one thing to remind, it was a rumor or it was a news that Donald Trump was trying that until 21st, or if I'm right, 21st of January 2021, which is the last date of American presidency under Donald Trump. For now, the first presidency. I don't know if he wins again. Akshay can answer better. But I think until that, it was a rumor that Jared Kushner and Trump were trying to invite, if not Kushner, then Trump, Pompeo were trying to invite Imran Khan to actually go with Abraham Accords also between Israel and Pakistan. It's a rumor, may not be true. It was a news, maybe, but it was something there. So not just Pakistan, even other countries like Muslim countries and so forth, Islamic countries. Considering these aspects, Turkey and the urge to do so and proxy actors, how do you this is a question to all of you. How do you see the entanglements and how much the proxies and how much Erdogan has tried to affect the growth and I would say the development and so forth, the growth of the Abraham Accords as an agenda of development, as an agenda of security considerations. So how do you see? So I think Dr. Alveit this time can begin and then Akshok can follow up. So yeah.
I mean, with regard to Turkey, in terms of supporting or propping up proxies, that nothing would beat the Iranians what they are doing in the Middle East. If you talked about Lebanon, if you talk about Syria. If you talk about Iraq, they tried in Saudi Arabia, but kind of a fail. They tried in Bahrain also. That kind of a fizzle out after a point in time. With Turkey, the entry of Turkey into the Syrian crisis sometime in September 2015 had given a kind of a leeway to the Turks to start wielding some of its influence in the Middle East, and that also had given a good amount of encouragement, fighting along or cooperating along the Russians in Syria, had given a very good amount of leeway to the Turks to kind of flex its muscles once again. But how much it has been successful in propping up proxies in the region, that remains to be that can be questioned, because when we talk about, again, to reiterate what I just mentioned, the manner in which Iran has been successful in propping up the proxies in this country that I've mentioned is remarkable. And that is also one of the reasons why countries like Israel or and again, with all the historical accounts in the early 80s with the Osiris and others, and the Scud missiles coming into the Israeli territories in early 90s, Israel also has major concerns about what's happening in Iraq. The geographical expanse might be that it could be very far, but then it has its own concerns. But when it comes to Turkey, in terms of its involvement in other parts of the region, so far what we have seen is mostly in the Syrian theater, in terms of giving certain logistical support to the rebels fighting. But then in military wise, if I have to say that they have some sort of an agreement with the Assad regime in terms of those buffer zones, or I forgot the term that they use for it, and some sort of a logistical support, financial aid is all they have been doing right now. But whether that could translate into a full-fledged influence of Turkey in the region, that remains to be seen. But as of now, what remains to be the most important concerns for everyone is this antagonism or rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That seems to be also ebbing down in the last few months' time, because they have, which I can speak a little later about it, but about there are certain talks going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran and UAE also. In the last fourth round of talk happened just, I think, last week. So there are certain developments coming in, which again could also change the entire equation in the Middle East right now. So looking at all these, developments in the region, Turkey, while for one it is having its own ambitions to be a major player, I would say that it still needs to be wait and see what kind of a policy they would come out, because it is also trying to balance its relationship with Russia, at the same time with Israel. And if you see the developments with the US also, it is trying to kind of it's more of the real politics, more of that strategic component in the interests that Turkey is trying to play out with. And at the same time, it is also aligning with Chinese, which are closely aligning with the Russians and Russians also. So I would keep it that way. For me, it is a wait and watch when it comes to Turkey.
Yes, Akshay. Yeah. I think you can unmute. Yeah.
Yeah, no, of course. Look, I think there's been a fundamental shift of the way Turkey has been perceived in Turkey's actions since Recep Tayyip Erdogan. If you remember the last UNGA before the pandemic in 2019, Erdogan was very, very vitriolic in his statements. He had got a map of the Israel-Palestine homelands and showed from 48 till now how there's been, rapid encroachment. And of course, that is fundamentally true. However, let's not forget there's also been another alliance, as the sort of strategic partnership, if you may call it, between Pakistan, Malaysia, and Mahathir Mohamad and Turkey, jokingly called as PTM. And of course, they had coalesced to try and say that, look, we're going to start a channel that counters Islamophobia. Don't forget that the Pakistan Foreign Ministry was very successful in getting someone like Mahathir Mohamad, who in his first few stints in the 70s was a friend of India, to be very, very bellicose on the Kashmir issue. Because don't forget, Article 370 had just been abrogated in 2019, so those issues came to forefront. Mahathir Mohamad and Recep Tayyip Erdogan had brought it out, and this is actually a very delicate balancing act for Turkey. But under Erdogan, he's sort of been more iron hand, no velvet glove, because what's really been fundamental is because the fact that Turkey is still a NATO ally. So, while we're talking about, not to digress here, but we're talking about like S-400 and the purchase from Russia and possible CASA sanctions, and that India is trying to balance out. Turkey doing that is a more of an affront, because Turkey is a signature ally to NATO, which means it is bound by Article 5 and also all other implications of being a NATO ally, whereas India does not have that formal alliance. So Turkey has had to do a very strategic balancing. And don't forget, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, like Imran Khan, like Mahathir Mohamad, then bought his silence on the Uyghur issue of China, because don't forget, there's the elephant in the room in this case is the dragon. That's China, and that's fundamentally how China has been operating in West Asia as well. Um, so under Turkey right now, there's definitely been a sense of a concern in the Western world of where Turkey for too long, from its erstwhile Constantinople days, has always been seen as this bridge between the West and the East, just both geographically and culturally. It's seen as this, this state that's a secular state of Islam more than an Islamic fundamental state. And for long you always said Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia. Those are sort of the way the Western world looks at this place. If we can get solve our problem with Islamic radicalism, we need more states to be more like Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia. That's sort of, and now Turkey has gone away from that notion really, because under Erdogan there's been a complete concern of how Washington has to recalibrate its policy with Ankara. And fundamentally, we've known that since the Syrian refugee crisis, the issue with the Kurds, Turkey's obviously been one of the key antagonists over there and been anything but helpful on that front. And also with issues with regard to Iraq and Syria, Turkey has obviously been in the forefront. But more so, even though while Israel had, in fact, Turkey was actually the second Islamic country to recognize Israel, but of course, Turkey is not an Arab country, so we don't include that in our conversation of Israel and the Arab states. But after Egypt, it was Turkey that recognized Israel. So there's always been that legacy arrangement with Israel. And don't forget, if you think about it, and maybe it's a plug for a good TV series, Tehran, if anyone wants to watch it. But a lot of times where the IRGC and the Mossad have their turf battles, has always been in Istanbul, Ankara, or other parts of Turkey. It's sort of where Turkey's got relations with both Iran and Israel, the same way India does in some ways. And that's normally where that's been a hotbed of various geopolitical activity there. But under Turkey right now, there's also a concern that Turkey is a NATO ally that's not behaving like NATO ally. In some ways, it's a Pakistan without being the NATO ally, with being the NATO ally. That is, with friends like these, can we really trust them? So that I would add is definitely a concern right now. And again, under Erdogan, it's Erdogan's Turkey that's been a very, very fundamental different Turkey from what you've seen before. Because if you look at the understanding of great nation builders, one would obviously put people like, along with David Ben Gurion of Israel and Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, you put people like Kemal Ataturk, from creating this country from the ravages of the Ottoman Empire. And since then to now, obviously it's been a long time since that coming. But under Erdogan, there's been a fundamental shift to what the essence and the fabric of a social democratic setup like Turkey has been. We've seen there were attempted coups in the past. And right now, that's definitely a concern for Washington.
Can I just add something to what Akshok just mentioned about Turkey? It's very interesting that he has pointed out what we are, apart from the regional dynamics, particularly inside West Asia or in the Mediterranean. There has also been a visible attempt being made by Erdogan to be the leader of the Muslim world, the Islamic causes, and kind of challenging the legitimacy of Saudi Arabia to be the custodian of the two holy mosques. So if you see in the last, just very recent years, like 4 to 5, of course, while the change has been visible from 2002-3, when his party AKP came to power, there is a gradual shift in the way how Turkey has been functioning, both inside as well as in the external domain. But apart from your question about propping up the proxies or regional military security dimension, he also has been making an attempt to build up that sort of a cohort, some sort of groupism in term, particularly from the viewpoint of like say Islam, not a kind of a, remember those pan-Islam sort of a thing which was envisaged by Nasir in the 50s and the 60s, which was again carried on by Gaddafi. Sort of you have a leadership role to play in terms of bringing together like-minded countries. So it has gone all the way up to Malaysia. Erdogan is trying really hard to court, to rope in the support of Bangladeshis also. Then you have on our western neighborhood, the Pakistan has been trying to, get closer and closer to Pakistan. So as much as we are seeing this sort of groupism in the Middle East pertaining to Israel, Saudi Arabia, or UAE, or Bahrain, or any other Arab countries, there is also a simultaneous, attempt, which is going on, being made with countries like China, Turkey, Russia, then Pakistan will come in, then many of the other Shiite dominated countries in the region. So it is a very interesting dynamic. While we are seeing in one side, this sort of groupism coming with Israel and the others, there is also another simultaneous, very subtle, very again at the same time potential, grouping which is being, which is in the making. Yeah.
Akshay, would you like to add?
I think no. I think Professor Alwad summed that up perfectly, really. And there is like groupism that's coming, and for fundamentally just to a quick line to that as well. I mean, the relations with India is, of course, India is never publicly gonna have a public overture on this because that's the way India's height of India's foreign policy has always been saying something when nothing is to be said and saying nothing when something needs to be said. This is the saying nothing when something needs to be said part. But we've seen also like in its subtlety of the media, like since TRT World has come up, we've seen how like RT have operated, how CGTN has operated, while Al Jazeera gets a little more flack than it should. But we've seen this sort of overtures, and TRT World has been very, very public in its stance on various issues, at least on the Israel-Palestine issue, that's very well noted, and also on the issue with regards to India and Pakistan and Kashmir. We've seen there's a complete sense of there's no delicate balancing with TRT World right now, and we've seen a lot of the Imran Khan exclusives do go to TRT World apart from the Western media. So the seismic shift is very, very evident in Turkey.
Indeed. So let's get on to the role of India in West Asia post Abraham Accords. And let me put a simple context in 2 to 3 minutes and not much, because it's a kind of a dialogue and a kind of a panel discussion. Actually, not a dialogue, but a panel discussion. So there is no doubt that when it comes to two critical regions for the Indo-Pacific, which is Southeast Asia and West Asia, and I'm not mixing any of them. I'm just mentioning that this is my opinion that they are two important critical regions for the Indo-Pacific when it comes to India's centricity and India's role. Of course, China is there, but that's a different question altogether, and that's not the aspect of this discussion for now. But as we look at West Asia, post Abraham Accords. Now we know that India has endorsed the Abraham Accords, and in spirit and also in other terms, India wishes to foster cooperation on various aspects. Intelligence cooperation is a different issue, but I think when it comes to military cooperation as well as technology cooperation, India is already trying to get some better considerations done with the Saudis as well as the Israelis, and maybe with the UAE in the future. I remember a very interesting report which was published, and I don't remember, the person is on Twitter. This person proposed that from your Gujarat, from your, maybe, I don't know, not Kutch, but maybe Ahmedabad or somewhere. Okay, it will be Surat. From Surat in Gujarat to all along in that arc where you have Chabhar and all of that, in that arc up to UAE, which is Dubai or Sharjah, let's say. And from there you go to Saudi, which is landlocked. Up to there, I think maybe the person added Bahrain and then Israel. And then you go up to Greece. You can actually create a trade route from India to Europe through Greece and India at the periphery, and at the middle, these countries in. And this was a very interesting proposition being made. Now, of course, it's a question on the Indian foreign policy considerations when it comes to the Ministry of External Affairs as to how much active will they be, and there are constraints as well as opportunities for them to do so. So now, Minister Jaishankar and even Mukhtar Abbas Naqvi, the Minister for Minorities, has been going all along. And even if I remember, the army chief Naravne has been also going to the Middle East a few times recently, even in 2021, even in 2020, and in the, I don't remember, October, November, Mr. Jaishankar and Minister Naqvi went to meet MBS. And ironically, we see that while and from there we will connect the Afghanistan, but not right now because it's a complicated issue. We see one trend that India is already forging a scheme of cooperation for long and in a long run sense, which is fine. I think there are avenues. So the question is to the panelists, and maybe Akshop can start here, and then Dr. Alwhite can continue on there. Do we is they are there some creative avenues for India to go ahead with it, to understand its own problems? Because we know that West Asia, and when it comes to uh, terrorism based on fundamentalism, as we know, has already shown its, I would say, uh, game in India, and especially the South Asian region in the Indo-Pacific, that countries like India and Bangladesh are being affected by terrorism of that sort. And that's one avenue, but otherwise, of course, economy and other things are there. So how much creatively India should act, number one, and number two, are there any problems for India when it comes to its paucity or something like that? And if yes or no, how what can be further approached per se? So Akshop, maybe you can begin, and then Dr. Alwhite can continue.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think the foreign minister is actually in Israel this weekend, and General Manoj Mukund Navrane was in the Middle East long ago. R.K. Baduria, the air chief then, was also has made those trips since the Abraham Accords. Now, for India, it's always been a very delicate balancing act in the past, right? Don't forget that India's own relations with Israel was very, very different. In 48, India voted against the creation of Israel because Gandhi and Nehru, believing that the subcontinent should not be partitioned on religious lines, could not agree to the Palestinian homeland being partitioned, the British mandate of Palestine rather being partitioned on religious lines. And in fact, Gandhi famously said, Palestine belongs to the Palestinians, just like Britain belongs to the British and France to the French. That's what Mahatma Gandhi actually said. So in 48, India voted against the creation. In 1950, India just acknowledged, okay, the state of Israel. But until 1992, India had no formal diplomatic relations. Nehru and Ben Gurion had met, but there was only a consulate in Bombay, which meant there was almost like a diplomacy by half. There was no embassy in Delhi, and India did not have an embassy in Tel Aviv. Fundamentally, and even in 1981, India and Palestine had put up a commemorative stamp with Yasser Arafat. And, I think Ambassador Trigunayat, former Indian ambassador in Jordan, had actually pointed out that, before India opened up to Israel, they actually consulted with Yasser Arafat. And this was also, don't forget, a couple of the key things happened then in 1991. One is the Indian economy liberalized. So investments were coming in. Two is the end of the Cold War, which meant the end of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And three being obviously the Oslo Accords were coming around that time. So the winds of change were already there. So India in the early 90s finally acknowledged and formed full diplomatic relations with the state of Israel. However, keeping the fact that India's solution, and even during the Gaza crisis that erupted over this summer, India unequivocally said and still maintains that a peaceful, viable, long-lasting solution to a two-state situation in the Middle East. And while India has relations with Israel, and don't forget, until 2017, no Indian Prime Minister had formally set foot on Israeli soil. So and one would argue, right? So a lot of times there is this confusion, or rather this forgetful. I mean, for people can be myopic at times and thinking that, oh, India and Israel. But look, fundamentally, there are a couple of things here, right? One is, of course, it's the relation Israel has grown given Israel's sophistication, ag technology and military technology. Israel IDF forces and joint training with Indian forces, and IDF has actually helped out India during not just the Kargil war, but also during the Bhuj earthquake with relief programs. And fundamentally, it's also where Palestine is. Let's not forget that we keep talking hyphenating Israel Palestine, but one's a country and the other one's not even a state. It's not recognized, and one has a lot of land, and the other barely has any land. So, for a lot of people, Indian interlocutors, some people say, "Oh, what do we get with Palestine?" I mean, it's apples and oranges, because you don't really have. Palestine as a state has unfortunately been deprived of providing resources to its own people, courtesy occupation in the West Bank. I have no problem unequivocally calling it that. So India's always had a delicate balancing on this front. Don't forget, India's also been on the West Asia front. India's obviously said, like, look, our relations with Iran are crucial for our energy needs. India is, of course, a large energy importer. Given the sanctions that the West has had on Iran, it's actually helped India's current account deficit, getting oil at a much cheaper price. And India is very crucial with ties Israel for defense needs. After Russia, Israel's India's second largest defense provider, particularly also in drone technology as well. Now, and India's because of its being strategic autonomy, India is able to recalibrate and sort of Venn diagram or sort of mutual fund its relations with various countries without without having an all or nothing basket, which is why sometimes alliances are more hindering than helpful. On this front, India has always been able to balance that, and even then, India's relation with Iran has been very crucial. Of course, the partnership with China, Iran, and China, the 25-year strategic partnership, has of course curtailed some of India's investments in Iran, particularly on the Chabahar port in Zardan. But what really has been very helpful to India is the fact that India has been able to maintain those relationships. Don't forget, even with Iraq, India had friendly relations with Saddam Hussein, and India has trained Iraqi pilots on how to use the MiG, which of course is a legacy Russian era equipment that the Indian Air Force swears by. So that delicate balancing with Abraham Accords is not there as much right now, given there's larger overt GCC Israel ties, diplomatic relations, people to people contact, business ties flowing around. So for India, which has long had, to had walk this trap rope on how to balance it out, no longer has to do that with the Abraham Accords. But of course, India fundamentally still unequivocally maintains for a two-state solution, and that's not changed. However, the concerns that India does have with the Middle East, and that's always been concerns as well with some of the fundamentalism and the radicalism that does come, particularly from Afghanistan. Let's not forget the most well-trained and well-funded and well-known Mujahideen was a Saudi national, and 16 out of the 19 hijackers in the we passed 20th anniversary of 9/11 were Saudi nationals as well. So there has been definitely that sense of Wahhabism that's percolated, and and right now even in the Middle East with Daesh, and now you've seen ISIS-K in parts of Afghanistan, that is still a concern. So even when India, don't forget when India's relation to the Middle East also with Qatar, and we know that the Taliban with the Doha Shura has had a significant presence. Sanic Zais and Doha, and Qatar has been a very significant brokering these quote-unquote peace deals. But India, while did not fundamentally not acknowledge the Taliban in the past, but India's ambassador to Qatar, Deepak Mittal, did have a conversation with Sanic Zai, and the primary concern that came out, apart from peaceful transfer of all Indian nationals and protecting Afghan minorities, was the fact that Afghanistan, the soil of Afghanistan, will not be used for a launch pad with the Qataris as well as with the Taliban representatives in Qatar, because we've seen how this part played out in the 90s. So just to kind of sum up that, for India, I think the delicate balancing act is not there as much with the Abraham Accords. But that's India's foreign policy. It's always been a sense of strategic autonomy and a sense of, friends with everyone, allies with no one, and recalibrating, picking your horses for courses, if I may put it that way.
Really nicely put. Before Dr. Albright intervenes, I'd just like to add one point as a follow-up question to Dr. Albright, and of course, then Akshob can also put up. So, of course, I agree that the balancing act thing is not there anymore, and India can, of course, liberalize its own options under the strategic autonomy consideration. I think one thing is very clear, that India is very sensitive about these things when it comes to strategic autonomy, and it wants to shape it, and that is something which, as you very rightly stated, it's changing. On that note, uh, can we at least say that if there are considerations for coming up with more infrastructure centric cooperation, like I stated about that report by a professor, I don't remember. If I find a tweet, I'll show it on the screen. By chance, uh, uh, if can infrastructure related cooperation is possible when it comes to India led or India oriented. Let's not say India led to a larger extent. I'm not talking about investment money right now, but I'm saying some aspects of limited alignment for a better, maybe better gains per se. So maybe Dr. Albright can weigh in, and then maybe Akshov can weigh in.
Yeah, I will not go into the historical aspect. Abshok has given a brief account of what was the situation between India and the Gulf War Israelis from the 40s onwards. But if you see the recent trend, India, for one, looks at this Abraham Accord with interest and at the same time with caution also. That's my reading of the developments taking place. When it comes to India's relationship with the wider, West Asian region, we have seen a marked, an upward trajectory in the last 6 to 7 years. There has been a kind of a, attempt, or there are several attempts being made by the present government about giving some sort of a fillip to the missing link, that is the political link between India and the, West Asian countries. The fact that Prime Minister had visited almost all the West Asian countries, barring few, Yemen, Lebanon, or Iraq, or Syria, also kind of a, it's a kind of a signal that there is a political will or a goodwill to enhance our relationship with almost all the countries over there. And the Prime Minister Modi visiting Israel in 2017, and reciprocated by the Israeli former Prime Minister Netanyahu in January 2018, also had given some sort of a strategic component to the bilateral relationship. And see, we have been buying arms from Israel from openly or tacitly or whatever from the 90s onwards, and even during the 70s also, like, we received those help. But military relationship or arms trade would not be alone sufficient to kind of uplift the relationship. So you need that political component, which has been given by the visit of the Prime Minister, no doubt about it. But at the same time, with the other West Asian, other Gulf countries, there has been an upward trajectory in the last 6 to 7 years. No longer the relationship between India and the Gulf countries are being measured in terms of how much remittances have been coming into the country. What is the nature of our diaspora or the expatriate community in the region? How much oil we are buying from these suppliers from the Gulf region? While all these three factors continue to remain or continue to have their own significance and prominence, we are now gradually expanding our relationship to a much wider area, a wide gamut of, that you talked about, the infrastructural development projects. The pace could be slow. There are, talks about, strategic oil reserves to be to be built in India. There are certain problems that run into it in the construction of those reserves in the state where I'm sitting right now in Maharashtra, because of the land problems with the the farmers and the others. But in terms of taking advantage of what we are seeing right now in terms of Abraham Accord, many high-level politicians, or the leaders, I would say, many high-level leaders or the diplomats have been talking about having some sort of a trilateral or multilateral mechanism involving India, Israel, UAE, or Bahrain, for that matter, to have some sort of joint collaborations in certain areas, mutually beneficial to all the countries. Having said this, one of the earliest signals that have come out right after the accord was the trilateral cooperation between Israel, India, and UAE in terms of building certain technologies for the renewable sources of energy. That was sometime in the month of, I think, March or April, May. Yes. As a first of its kind, the International Federation of Indo-Israel Chambers of Commerce initiated a trilateral partnership between Israel, India, and the UAE to develop an innovative robotic solar cleaning technology. So that was right after the Abraham Accord, like few months after the Abraham Accord was signed. But how much of infrastructural development projects would we be able to take remains to be seen, because there is also another country equally looking for their own penetration in terms of taking advantage of the realignment in the Middle East. That is China. Because if we compare the investments, or if we compare the infrastructural development projects between India and China in the Middle East, Chinese are way ahead of us. So we are gradually making some inroads in the last, particularly in the oil and energy sector. Like we have seen in the case of Israeli Leviathan oil exploratory programs up in the northern part of Israel. We have our own companies working there. 5 to 6 Indian companies are working there. But apart from that, if you talk about railway line projects, electrocommunication projects, highway building projects, like you already have seen a massive Chinese influence or Chinese footprint in the region. So that is going to be a kind of a competition, not exactly a challenge. Okay, the challenge would only come when there is a kind of a parity in the way how we are dealing with the Chinese companies. But your point about the infrastructural development project, there are of course prospects for it, and we will have to see where are those projects India is going to be involved in. Is it going to be in the field of solar technology? Is it going to be in the field of railway lines, electrocommunications? While there are certain indications coming out from UAE about some sort of collaborative efforts in the field of defense between India and the UAE companies, apart from Israel and other countries. So I would keep it that way in terms of infrastructural projects. Yeah.
So, Akshob, you can of course give a follow up, but before that, it's a very interesting report which viewers can just like have a glance at it, not a detailed look because the panel has its own limitations of time. So this was the report by Michael Tankum or Tanchum, if I'm right, Tankum actually. It was on India's Arab Mediterranean corridor. So it was about a strategic connectivity too. It's published by NUS, National University of Singapore. So what he proposed essentially was, if I get the map, I might not, maybe unfortunately, or maybe I do. Okay, it's not here maybe. So what he actually suggested was that from Gujarat or Maharashtra in India, you can start your route along to the arc, and you can go up to UAE, and then you can have the plan. So maybe viewers can read this as they being watch the session, and maybe a lot could be understood by this as well. So yeah, yes, Akshob, you can go ahead with your follow-up.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously Dr. Albright has, very chronicled the economic, commercial ties and the diplomacy there. But, I think this also be a very crucial point to bring in China here, because let's not forget what China's relation to West Asia has fundamentally been. What has Beijing done, right? Beijing has, since what was called OBOR, now it's BRI. It's also following the Great Silk Road route, because to understand Chinese foreign policy, how it comes with understanding of Chinese history. And as a former professor of mine wrote a book called Haunted by Chaos, speaking about how right from the Qing dynasty to Xi, there is this overhang of China being this great civilization that's been humiliated by the West first, imperial forces, then Japan, and constantly has never really seen its place where it should, which is why there is now a fundamental difference between, as I said, between Deng Xiaoping's China, which is fundamentally believed in a higher strength by their time, to Xi Jinping China, which is belligerence and bellicosity, that believes there's only iron hand, no velvet glove. And we've seen that in China's overtures. But what does China believe in West Asia, right? Like, particularly with things like Iran, Afghanistan, maybe obviously South Asia, but let's look at it as Southwest for this argument, and the rest of the Middle East. China comes in by saying, look, we, unlike the Western forces, unlike, say, the colonial forces of Britain and France, were not here to divide up territory and create the problems. We were never here before. So, and I mean, maybe at the time of the Silk Road, but or even the United States with its with the sword of Damocles of its foreign policy hanging over Iran, hanging over Iraq, hanging over the Middle East. China comes in none of that. China has no requirements, unlike the Washington, which long believed that unless you're a purveyor of peace and democracy, you are a threat to what's, because given when it was a race between two power blocks, it was long before George Bush was on the scene, it was a you're with us or you're against us, right? Which is why for long, Washington did not take too kindly to India's non-aligned movement, because it was like, well, if we can't really get a temperature check on this, you're clearly allied with someone else. But what does China say in this case? China is fundamentally saying, hang on a minute, we do not have any ideological requirements. Wahhabism, that's fine. Shia theocracy, Iran, that's fine. Having a sense of Assad in China, Assad in Syria, we're not gonna. We fundamentally want peace and stability, but we're not gonna make that our prerequisite of following a certain regime, because we ourselves have a regime that the West does not align with. So But hey, you look like you need roads and railways and infrastructure. That's our specialty. You look like you need loans and affordable costs. That's our specialty. And that's what the BRI through CPEC has been. That's what the BRI through various other initiatives has been. Obviously, China and Afghanistan, ironically, was more concerned with the US pullback, because what that means is a security vacuum. And when there's a security vacuum, as we've seen in the past in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Libya, it doesn't really bode well. In Afghanistan as well. So China, of course, is concerned with its investments on the BRI. We've seen even in the restive province of Balochistan what it means with some we've seen attacks as well on Chinese migrant workers as well as consular officials. So China was concerned in that, but we've seen Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, meet with Taliban officials. I think with Mullah Baradar, if I'm not mistaken, and try to establish that, look, as long as we get peace from your side, we're peace from our side, we'll just establish it this way. Because China fundamentally, what it said to all the other countries is, look, we are 21st century diplomacy. We do not care on your own personal liberties and how you want to go about things. But you look like you need roads, railways, infrastructure, we can help. And for countries like Iran, that really helped. But given the sanctions that Iran has, the only way to counter those sanctions is getting those investments. And China is, of course, a very large energy dependent country, which is why even when, don't forget, the US and EU had imposed sanctions on Russia after the Crimea annexation in 2014, Russia and China signed a big agreement as well. So that really helped Russia as well. So that was fundamentally kept the 25-year strategic partnership between China and Iran, helps keeps the Iran's coffers alive as well. And as Dr. Albright said, that's where China is far ahead of the game than anyone else. And that's a sense of economic diplomacy, or maybe you want to call it debt trap diplomacy, as it's known and seen with places like Hambantota and Sri Lanka. And that's fundamentally China's operation in West Asia. And in terms of, which is why the United States, and long before, when for the BRI, said, hey, we see your BRI and we raise the Indo-Pacific. And now Biden sees the BRI has gone to such a point, which is why the whole Build Back Better world of saying, and if you look at a lot of these measures are a game of saying, let's name China without naming China. It's like we have transparent loans, we have building for the common good, everything that is saying that's not what Beijing is doing, but we're going to do that. And that was fundamentally a G7 initiative that came out this time to counter a sense of Beijing's transparency. Even we saw at the Quad Summit, it was like name China without naming China, right? There's a free and open Indo-Pacific, rules-based international order, security and growth for all in the region. So there's a clear overture on this. As I said, sometimes when it's so covert, it's actually more overt. So I'll leave that there for now.
I just want to add to
Sure.
it's very, very interesting points being raised by Akshov about this Chinese, the kind of a narratives they have been able to build up, a kind of a challenging the Western narratives about being, the imperialist powers or the colonizers. So none of those things have been, have been applicable to the Chinese as per what they had to say. So it's kind of a win-win, win-win situation sort of a thing that they are promoting to the Middle Eastern countries for the last many years. If you look at the 2016 January, China's Arab paper policy, China's Arab policy paper, it is a very, very detailed policy layout. Very the kind of areas that they would like to emphasize on in West Asia, particularly keeping into consideration the connectivity projects which Akshab just mentioned about. They have something called 1+2+3 agreement. The one being the energy dimension of the cooperation, the two being the technological part of the the cooperation, and the two would be the infrastructure and the technological part of the cooperation, and the third is something called, they said, like new technology, like cyberspace and space and technology. So if you see the pattern of the Chinese involvement in West Asia, all these investments or corporate investments or bilateral agreements have got to do with these components, 3-4 components, and they are the major activities that are going on right now in the Middle East. So they have been able to create that optic, and at the same time that narrative that we are not interventionist. We are we haven't interfered in the geopolitics of the region, and you should be able to trust us. And this is what we can offer you depending upon your requirements. So they have been doing that, and we will have to see how far they are successful, in really penetrating inside the country. Yeah.
Great. So I would just like to show a very interesting part of that same report. I just found out the map finally, and then of course I'll get on Afghanistan and a little bit about infrastructure. Of course, some major aspects have been covered already, but maybe that would be the final point. And within which I will discuss more about the role of the Europeans. But let me show this to the viewers. So this is what the conclusion of the professor is, that it is that India's new Arab Med corridor to Europe is an emerging multimodal commercial corridor that promises to reconfigure the patterns of trade between the Indian Ocean region, the Middle East, and Europe by creating an arc of commercial connectivity. And of course, he has proposed this. Now, I would like to show page number 11. I don't know who made the map, but this is the map. So this is what exactly what he was proposing. Ironically, he merged the Indian subcontinent together. That's a different question altogether. I did not know why he do it, but he can. I mean, what can I do about it? He did it ironically, but leaving that anomaly, I think that's what he exactly proposed. That it can start from there. So I mean, just a quick take if Dr. Alwhite and Akshay wish to have, just looking at the map, not of course. We'll go to the final point of the discussion. Yeah.
Akshay, would you like to go ahead with this? Now the map is very interesting. Yeah, if this gets materialized, then nothing like it for India, for the regions that are, but then I have my own because there are see if you see the countries like which is like cutting from India to, I can see UAE, then parts of Saudi Arabia, then you have Jordan, you have Israel, yes, then you have all the way up to, I think, Italy, right?
No,
Cyprus,
Italy is the one there with on the other side, the one which is not highlighted. I think
right?
yeah.
But since I haven't read the entire text of his explanations pertaining to what he has envisaged by showing this map, I will not be able to make any comments, particularly on this aspect. But in terms of connectivity, there were already, again, what kind of a connectivity is the author, talking about here? Is it only about energy sort of a connectivity, or so? I will not be able to comment much on this. So I let me come back to it again. Let Ashok take the floor with this.
No, Dr. Alwai, I share your trepidation. I myself have not read this report, so I may not be able to connect on it. But yes, very interesting map. Normally, you've seen even if misrepresentation of Kashmir really gets flared up on either side. So merging the Indian subcontinent with Bangladesh and Pakistan, that's definitely a first. Unless it's a very, I don't think it's a utopic pre-1947 map, because then the state of Israel would not be seen as well. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on sea routes and land routes here, but that would be along the Arabian Sea and then a bit of Persian Gulf and seeing a little bit of UAE, then all the way across Saudi Arabia. So from the southeast corridor to the northwest, and then I'm guessing a little bit of Jordan and Israel, which Jordan has ties with Israel, of course, and then again a sea route again all the way across to Greece, and then I don't know where the dotted lines stop at, but yeah, I mean, look, it's very interesting. I think it's a little utopic as well, because let's not forget, one of the reasons that India has objected in the past to the BRI is because of that it runs through what India calls Pakistan occupied Kashmir, or maybe international as Pakistan administered Kashmir, the Gilgit-Baltistan region, which of course is how the CPEC runs through within China and Pakistan as well. And one of the reasons that that Pakistan has obviously long been concerned with India's trade with Afghanistan, because don't forget, India and Afghanistan have had a legacy era, a trade, that goes all the way back to till pre-independence India. The stories of the Kabuliwalas, bringing dry fruits and raisins from all the way across has long been part of Indian folklore. So that trade has a lot of time been mitigated, because India now formally does not share a land border with Afghanistan, and trade through Pakistan has been very, very hindered, and we've seen every time there's geopolitical tension that those trade routes get cordoned off a lot more, which is why Pakistan again is very crucial for
the US involvements in Afghanistan. But I digress here. So I think it's a very utopic thing, because don't forget, the tyranny of geography precludes a lot of India's direct land routes that are happening, because there's China on one side and Pakistan on the other. So this mixture of sea and land is probably one way to think about it. But I'm not sure how viable this is. Like I said, I haven't read the report, and maybe I will. But it's definitely interesting.
Are we like
Sure.
with the exclusion of like India's part, while we can have a hypothetical situation where we can connect, and of course there have been lots of attempts to make more connectivity between India and this part of the world. But if you're one interesting aspect of this map that I found is, if you're looking only at the hinterland of the West Asia, like connecting Israel, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia in 2017-18, there were certain talks by the Israelis, by the Jordanians, to revive something called the Hejaz railway line in Saudi Arabia, where they were trying to connect the northern part of Israel with the northern tip of Jordan, some sort of a road connectivity and railway connectivity, then going down all the way to Saudi Arabia. So that also, yes. So if you see on the Israeli territory and the Jordanian territory, including the Saudi territory, the projection was it was all over the news sometime in 2017. I remember very well. From the northern part of Israel, along the Lebanon, Syria, that tri-junction, it went all the way up to Jordan, and from Jordan it it goes down towards the western part of Saudi Arabia along the Red Sea. So that was one connectivity that I'm aware of. But of course, the author must be having his own analysis of making this these connections between the European part and the Levant in the the upper part of Israel, and all the way up to Saudi Arabia, then UAE. So yeah, we can have another round of discussion on this,
Yeah.
some other day.
Interesting Mediterranean route, though.
Right.
No, I agree on that. I definitely agree that I did not share this before. I'm extremely sorry for that. But I've shared it on the private chat. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, shared it on the private chat. So I just found it interesting. That's why I did. But anyways,
Of course.
so definitely. So as we're getting, sorry, just give a second. So as we're getting to the final part of this discussion, I'll merge the last two pointers together, because some background to the Afghanistan issue and the BRI aspect has been already given. Now, whatever has happened in Afghanistan, we actually see a trend that China is trying to make its own inroads. Now, of course, it's a conflict economy, which means that you don't have a sense of some sort of stability, and lack of stability is something which, it's not about graveyard of civilizations only, which people usually call about on Afghanistan, but I think that's something which is a pragmatic aspect which we can see right now. The pragmatic in the sense that what we can see right now. So there is one planning that, okay, China may go ahead with its BRI initiative and may try to do it. We don't know how will it go ahead through Afghanistan as a landlocked route. Another initiative, which I remember in July or in August, and Foreign Minister Qureshi from Pakistan did actually meet with Secretary Blinken, and they actually had their own quad also. US, Afghan, Pak, and one more country. I don't remember. Maybe it's Uzbekistan or some other country. They had their quad also, ironically, and that quad is also thinking about avenues of cooperation and non-cooperation. So there, as Akshay rightly said, and we all know historically, Pakistan is a proxy in the sense that, fine, you have to handle some things in the Central Asian and some aspects of West Asia. You need Pakistan when it comes to the United States. So shifting away focus from India for a while, as the Abraham Accords has come in, we see that at least countries are concerned in West Asia, especially the Gulf, when it comes to the incidents in Afghanistan. So from a strategic aspect, when we see the aftermath, again, we don't know what's going to happen there, because again, uncertainty is there, and we know that Taliban is all not a monolithic entity. It has its own diverse proxies and so forth. how far do we see the reaction of countries like Iran, Turkey, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia when it comes to the Afghanistan situation? And to add up to that, as we see that the United States and European Union countries are under a big backlash when it comes to the way they, the way the situation has been, and the way they are reacting to the Afghan people when it comes to, you know, the support. I would say, of course, the withdrawal is of course going to the US. But when it comes to European countries, the problem that came in was that many Afghan people were trying to connect with the embassies and so forth, and they were like out of the reach. India tried to do it its best, but of course, it had some flaws. There's a thread on India's refugee policy, which can be discussed later. But considering that, what could be expected for India in the sense that when these three countries I'm talking about, the Saudis, the Iranis, and so forth, the Turkic, how will they actually react accordingly, and what do they expect from, considering the case that BRI may or may not succeed? I don't think so. My view is that they would not be able to make a pipeline, or whatever we call it, an escalation point for getting along the landlocked Afghanistan because of the security issues, and that it's a conflict economy there. It's a problem there, but maybe I might be wrong. So we can start with Dr. Alvite and then Akshay, and then maybe we can come up with some concluding remarks.
Yeah, see, Abhi, I will not be able to comment much on the Chinese. Apart from watching China's involvement in West Asia or Middle East, I don't watch Afghanistan that closely. But the kind of if you are trying to make a connection with all this Abraham Accord and development in Afghanistan, or for that matter, how India is viewing at it. We haven't seen, barring Qatar, and in fact, Turkey has just received the delegation of Taliban, and kind of asking the international community to engage with Taliban's approaches to improve on the humanitarian crisis in the country. But at the same time, countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia and Iran, of course, at least in the outside appearances, they are showing some sort of a wait and watch kind of an attitude. Saudi Arabia, for one, is a very interesting country. Again, the kind of linkages it has with Taliban, particularly before the 2001 the World Trade Center attack, and how it has come under lots of pressure from the international community, particularly from the United States, to sever those ties with the Al Qaeda and its affiliates and other terrorist organizations, and so it had to remain low for a while. This book by Christopher Jeffrello, about Islamic Connection, is a beautiful book that talks about the kind of support that was given by countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia to the Taliban particularly before 2001. Even Akshay mentioned very briefly about the shuras in Pakistan, in Iran, and Qatar, the kind of backings they receive from these economically affluent countries in the Middle East. But now, one interesting thing that I've seen, or as per my assessment, when it comes to the tactics of Taliban in Afghanistan, that is also something that we in India are also closely looking at. What kind of a policy it is coming out in terms of freedom of press or security, how they are going to treat women, or are they going to resort to those very primitive or very medieval sort of tactics again. But at the same time, if you are looking at Saudi and UAE, Saudi is in a kind of on its way to have some sort of a course correction policies, particularly with its Vision 2030. It is trying to garner a good amount, or attract a good amount of investments coming in from different parts of the world for its own socio-economic reform programs. And in that process, it is also trying to send out a kind of a softer image of Saudi Arabia, not those images of barring women from entering the sports stadium, or not allowing women to travel alone without any male or guardianship. And if Saudi is very particular about toning down its image of being a very conservative society, respectful of women, safeguarding, the freedom of expression and other rights, it would have to come strongly against, the Talibs, a very primitive sort of ruling or medieval sort of governance or policy in the country. So that is something which we need to keep a close watch on. Likewise with UAE also. UAE for one, UAE and Saudi Arabia, they have been charged under the, they have been targeted for their support of certain Islamist groups in the past. So if again, both these countries are, as I mentioned in my introductory remark about going back to non-oil revenues, non-oil activities, they are at the same time trying to give out a signal that we are a softer version of what you had seen earlier. So in that process, like, it would have to tailor its policy vis-a-vis Taliban accordingly also. Not accepting what the Talibs are doing by coming out with a very aggressive policy or a very militaristic sort of governance. So that is something I would keep at. Ashok can come in this.
Yeah, look, fundamentally, if you think about it, really, just in the early 1990s, or just on mid 1990s, when in Pakistan, I think that Pakistan are propping up the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar regime long before Taliban. Only three countries recognize the Taliban regime: Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Pakistan. Qatar at that time was a little more obscure, but definitely would have coalesced with those three. And a very unusual sort of alliance where India was on. Well, India is one thing, but you have Iran, Russia, and the US all agreeing to back the Northern Alliance. And since then, right now is, even in Washington, when you heard about Trump and Pompeo giving Zalmay Khalilzadeh's orders saying go get a peace deal at all sorts, it was a very very contentious thing to try and get a peace deal with the Taliban. I mean, don't forget the fundamental roots of this conflict comes with the fact that you have called the Taliban the insidious force that they are, and giving patronage, homage, and shelter to someone who was a perpetrator of the 9/11 attacks, and then now suddenly believing there's a Taliban 2.0. Now this Taliban 2.0 has been propped up as one that wants peace, and yes, as Dr. Albaida said, and well known that the Taliban is not a monolithic entity. That being said, what you're also seeing with the Doha Shura, the Quetta Shura, or what you're seeing is just one form of it. You're seeing the Mullah Baradars or Suhail Shaheens and the Stanik Zais, and which are sort of the more political things. But as you've seen outside the media coverage of Kabul, we don't know what's happening with the Kandahar Taliban, which is of course one of the more vicious Taliban, the ones in Mazari Sharif or Herat or Jalalabad, those kind of various other Talibans. And we've known about the Haqqani network, which of course is one of the most violent factions of the Taliban. Jalaluddin Haqqani, we know, was one of was responsible for a lot of attacks, particularly even the one in 2008 on the Indian embassy in Kabul. And now Sirajuddin Haqqani, his son, is very much front and center. He even had the space to write an op-ed in the New York Times in February last year. And let's not forget that that even though Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson, made a mistake on that front, the Haqqani is still very much joined at the hip of the Taliban. Now people say, look, there's ISIS-K, which of course are responsible for the attacks, and they're against the Taliban because ISIS-K fundamentally believes in a caliphate, and they believe the Taliban is far more nationalistic because the Taliban is based on a sense of Pakhtun nationalism, which of course draws its roots from the Deobandi school of Islam. That were reared in madrasas during Indian independence as a counter to British rule. But those Deobandi school of Islam madrasas are very prevalent in Pakistan, Afghanistan today. That's where the erstwhile Taliban leader Mullah Omar derives a lot of his ideological moorings from. But again, people say, because ISIS-K is against the Taliban, and Joe Biden, in his earlier speech said, our biggest threat is still ISIS-K. Yes, but don't forget, long before the caliphate was established in the Levant in 2013, 2014, there was the Taliban that, for all intents and purposes, did have their own implementation of Sharia as well, right? I mean, while ISIS-K may come more from the Wahhabi school of Islam and Taliban more from the Deobandi school of Islam, we've seen what the Taliban in the 1990s did, using soccer fields for execution and stoning. So we know what this just suddenly assumed that the new leaf turned over. Because what this means for a lot of Afghans is there's a whole generation of Afghans whose median age is 18, who've not seen 9/11, who've not seen life under Taliban. And Afghan posterity is right now, at stake here. And it's fundamentally right now a situation which is completely. And don't forget, India, while Joe Biden said that Afghanistan is not important for nation building, India has done only nation building in Afghanistan without no boots on the ground. Since 2001, since the fall of Taliban, India has contributed by virtue of close to $3 billion, reconstruction of a new parliament, the Salma Dam, roads, schools, highways, railways, infrastructure, education facilities, closer ties with Afghanistan. Just to put the Indian diplomacy context into perspective, we know about how lean the Ministry of External Affairs is. They have 6 missions in the US, right? Washington and 5 other missions. They have 5 missions in Afghanistan, right? Kabul, Kandahar, Herat, Jalalabad, and Mazar-e-Sharif. Now, of course, all of them are closed right now since the fall of the government on August 15th, an auspicious date, no doubt. But you think about it, 6 missions in the US, right? The biggest geopolitical force, one where India and US trade is $150 billion, very important commercial strategic partners. But 5 in Afghanistan. In some ways, there is a method to the madness of Pakistan since the paranoia of India's involvement in Afghanistan, given that you have 5 missions in Afghanistan. Of course, not equally staffed the same way in the US, but it just shows that there is a sense of priority, because how many Indian expats do you probably find in Mazar-e-Sharif or Herat or Jalalabad? Sure, maybe there are a lot of construction work going on, but you wouldn't think it has to have the same diplomatic outreach the way India needs in the United States for the diaspora. But so there is a sense of concern there as well right now, because what this means is India's involvement in Afghanistan may be now precluded. We don't know what remains to be seen, who's going to recognize the current regime. We know Pakistan, China, Russia, and Iran still have diplomatic missions that they haven't closed it down. We've also known about the ISI chief visiting Kabul. Imran Khan soliloquies both at the UN as well as on interviews about there was no military solution, and Shah Mahmood Qureshi, the foreign minister, cheerleading on as if what was the quote that Afghans have been freed from the shackle of slavery, which of course is very troubling. And we also seen that's why the relations US and Pakistan have a tough time now. They're 10 years on. Joe Biden still not made a phone call to Imran Khan, and rumor has it that Imran Khan did not make a public speech at the UNGA because in person is because it was conditional based on the fact that he got a bilateral meeting with Joe Biden, and the phone call hasn't happened. The bilateral meeting is far from it. So I just want to set some of the stage of Afghanistan there before if you had a more specific question.
Great. Since we have certain time issues, let's wrap it up in a while. And I think maybe as the discussion escalates in a much nuanced way, we will be discussing more avenues of West Asia and Central Asian future. Maybe much nuanced considerations can develop. And I think with this primer on Abraham Accords and the whole conundrum around it, maybe much constructive discussions can happen. Maybe next time I'll invite the same professor who wrote that report, which I shared with you. So, with this satisfying note, I must say, I think I can safely say that we conclude with this discussion. But of course, we have to go ahead with concluding remarks for the viewers. And I would wish to request concluding remarks from both the panelists, and I will try to sum it up in the end. So let's start with Dr. Alvite and then Akshay. So, how would you like to conclude when it comes to the overarching understanding? Of course, when it comes to your experience in the discussion, and of course, on the very subject matter that we are discussing. So, Dr. Alvite, you can begin.
I found the discussion very enriching. Also, we have, I think, covered quite a few dynamics that a webinar usually doesn't cover. So branching out to every possible areas which can be connected with from Abraham Accord to the situation in Afghanistan and how it is going to impact the wider Middle Eastern region. I, for one, again, since the core discussion of today's the topic of today's discussion mostly concentrates on the Abraham Accord and the lessons or the implications it could have. This is a very interesting development. If we look from India's point of view, as I mentioned in my remark, it opens up quite a few opportunities for India to engage with some of these countries in West Asia. But at the same time, we also have to be really mindful of the other sort of groupism that is also being is in the making, or at least being discussed by other countries, or in West Asia, China, and then Russia. Uh, One thing that we can see in the Middle East right now is there is a growing sense of, at least that's my opinion, that they have, I think they have had enough of the external players coming and playing their own, or adopting their own policies in the region, that we have seen from the early period of Cold War also, and before that, in fact, but there is a kind of a growing realization within the region that they can no longer depend on the security blankets or the guarantees of the United States. This has become very prominent since the early part of 2011, when Obama administration did not do much to prevent Hosni Mubarak from falling into getting succumbed to the protesters. So that was one of the key developments which had given some sort of a food for thought to the West Asian countries, that you better pull up your socks and try to come up with a regional framework. So the discussions about the US, the possibility of US withdrawing completely from the Middle East, that remains a possibility, looking at what we are seeing in Afghanistan right now, and that the Iranians and the Saudis and the Emiratis are having some sort of a talk, also signals that they would want to have certain mechanisms in place, a regional sort of a framework in West Asia, to look after themselves, while they would continue to ask for certain help from certain Western countries. So the Abraham Accord, in fact, can be looked from all these dimensions, not only Israel, UAE, or Bahrain normalizing the relations, but the regional dynamics and its connections with the Accord, what each of these countries could do, also what India could do, what China might do, what Russia could do, taking advantage of the realignments in the Middle East. So I would keep it that way, and we can always discuss, in the future.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dr. Albright summed up really well. So, look, I know we've touched on a gamut of wide-ranging issue, and that just shows you the geopolitical interconnectedness of various parts. We touched on with the Abraham Accords, and then spoke about the Indo-Pacific and Afghanistan. Yeah, I'll try to keep this very brief for the brevity of time. Of course, Abraham Accords has been very, very transformational to Israel-Arab relations. It kind of now has seen more cross flow of trade and business style and diplomacy, and perhaps will pave the way for the elephant in the room for Saudi Arabia to come around to it and see it approach more. But it also means that, what does it mean for the Palestine issue? It doesn't really mean that Israel has mended its ways on Palestine, particularly right now. From Bibi to Naftali Bennett, we've gone more hawkish on the Israeli regime. Don't forget, someone like Naftali Bennett makes someone like Bibi look like left of center. So, and because he's publicly even said that there already is a Palestine, it's called Jordan. That's his words, not mine. So you can imagine what that means. So this also means that the Palestinian cause has gone more and more bleak. The sense of a two-state solution, which of course is the only viable way forward, as most international affairs scholars and Middle East experts have pointed out. That seems bleak, at least under the current Israel regime. But the way I've always spoken about it is, for something transformational to happen, Israel needs its own FW de Klerk. That was, of course, the South African Afrikaner leader who not just a Mandela, but needed de Klerk. Not just an MLK, but you need an LBJ as well. Someone within to roll back on the civil rights regime. So you need Israel. It's not just a strong Palestinian leadership. You need an Israeli leadership that's ready to really look at a viable solution for stay in the Middle East. Of course, this conflicts with a lot of the belief that Zionism has of it's not Palestine, it's a land of Judea and Samaria. And when that happens, that just precludes any sense of rationality. And also, don't forget, you've got massive settlements in the West Bank, settlements that are larger than Ramallah. So what do you do with the settlements? They're unlikely to move. They're not going to just move up there. And don't forget, Israel's biggest backer has been the United States. You've got strong lobbying houses like J Street and Jinsa, which of course have clamored for this. And I don't know if the winds of change are changing there, but definitely Israel's no longer as a very strong security state itself, doesn't need to worry about its security anymore. Even the one time its antagonist Saudi Arabia, also US ally, is on talking terms. So I think the way forward is to a two-state solution. Will that happen? Unlikely so, because the Abraham Accords is more of a sign of we accept things as they are. can't beat them, we'll just come around, and this benefits our economic relationship. On the Afghanistan issue, again, it's a wait and watch to see who comes around to recognize the Taliban regime. We've already seen some signs of Taliban 2.0 being really the only Taliban that we know, one that's driven by an ideological view of the world, and one that, for India, that's seen what the Taliban has meant in the past. That's meant also a restive region that's also affected its own insurgencies at home. And last but not least, as we just finished the inaugural Quad summit, the Quad is really gaining traction for towards a free and open Indo-Pacific. It's no longer a military alliance. It's never was a military alliance. AUKUS right now helps Quad in that way because that is a more military in its postures. And while Afghanistan, West Asia don't really have not really featured as much in the Indo-Pacific talk, which has been more from the Horn of Africa to the west coast of the United States, Pacific region, and ASEAN centrality. But as the vacuum of the United States pulling out of Afghanistan, it just means that China plays a bigger role, Iran, which are loggerheads of Taliban of Shia and Sunni ideology. Don't forget Taliban has attacked Iranian diplomats in the past, and now Russia. We've seen what security vacuums have meant in the past. So I'll leave it there for now, and thank you so much for inviting me on this discussion.
Indeed, grateful. Let's see how much quote-unquote radical Yair Lapid becomes after 2 years. So with that, anyways, yeah. So on that funny note, we end the panel 1 of the Indo-Pacific Mobility Forum and so forth, the episode 8, season 2 of Global Hint. Tomorrow we will have 2 more discussions happening. One at 4 p.m. I will be doing with Karthikeya Mishra and Ashish Yadav from JGLS, and we will be discussing about India's refugee policy from an international law perspective. And the last discussion for IPMF and the 15th episode of Indus Think will be featuring about Indic languages and how artificial intelligence can be used to revive them, as well as democratize education in the domain of knowledge economy and technology. So we really wish that everybody enjoyed the discussion, who will be watching it, as well as who watched it, as well as the panelists. So on a much satisfactory note, I must say, we end this discussion. I thank Dr. Alvite and Akshok for this talk. And with this, thank you, everyone. Namaste.